Thanks for singing, everybody. That sounded lovely. My name's Jamie. These are my opening remarks. For those of you who don't know me, I am a veterinarian, and as weird coincidence would have it, today is International Veterinary Day, which Juanita reminded me of. Now, I don't know what that actually means, but I assume it doesn't mean that all over the world veterinarians are stepping into Adventist pulpits and preaching the sermon. But that's what it means here, I think. The second thing I wanted to say is that at the moment our church we've just started a sermon series, Reset Back to Basics. This sermon isn't part of that, but it could be, because I'm talking about the concept of truth, which is fairly basic and fairly central. So you can look at today's sermon as like the annex on the caravan. It's not the caravan itself, but it's the annex, if that helps you. So I wanted to pick up the story at the trial of Jesus that led to his then execution on a cross the following day. And the trial was really an all-night experience. The Jewish leaders got together and they were conspiring to have Jesus executed. So they put up this kind of sham trial to try and find a way to get him to the point of being executed. And so they called their false witnesses and they testified and they couldn't get them to agree, so it wasn't going particularly well. But eventually they got to the point where they were convicted enough that Jesus had committed the crime of blasphemy, which for them was a capital offence. And so, great, we've got him where we want him. But no, we don't, because the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, a bit of a toothless tiger in that, sure, they could make that conviction, but they didn't have any political right to actually execute anybody. They needed Roman authority to do that. So they had to trundle Jesus off to the palace of Pontius Pilate. And did I not turn that on? That's probably more on. Okay, let's try that way. There we go. Where we pick up the story. So I'm going to read a passage from John 18 of Jesus interacting with Pontius Pilate, which is a fascinating story, but we can only look at a small detail of it today. I'm reading from the NIV. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover, which is kind of funny to me because they're prepared to commit murder, but they don't want to go in some unclean palace because they wanted to eat the Passover. But anyway, that's a side note. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Okay, well, that doesn't answer the question. Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it that you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I'm a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. With this he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him, but it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas," who had taken part in a rebellion. And the bit that I really wanted to concentrate on there as an introduction is that question. What is truth? Even though that question was asked by Pilate 2,000 years ago, it seems like a really relevant question for us today. It's almost like an existential question for us. What is truth? Because it feels like truth has taken something of a battering, particularly in recent years. In fact, in 2016, you know how they have dictionaries have the word of the year? The word of the year in 2016 is post-truth, which means relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So in the opinion of the Oxford dictionaries, that was word of the year because it summed up so much about what's going on in the world. We're post-truth. What an odd concept, that truth is something that we've got past. But then the very next year, another dictionary, the Collins people, nominated this as their word of the year. Fake news. Fake news was word of the year in 2017, which I have a problem with. You know, how can that be word of the year when it's 2 words? It's outrageous. What are these people doing? But anyway, fake news means false, often sensational information disseminated under the guise of news reporting. And that's the world we live in. We live in the information age, but accompanying that is a massive rise in misinformation. And where does that leave us? Where does that take us? One place it takes us is sometimes it takes us to almost an absurd level of passionate beliefs that people have in things that can't possibly be true. And somebody has seen this and reacted to it and come up with like a protest group, which is the that's gone on it's gone on psycho. We're up to the songs now. The Birds Aren't Real group. Have you heard of this? This is fantastic. So somebody in America went to they were in a town and there was a protest going on and somebody was campaigning about something weird. Well, not something weird, something passionate that they believed in. And then there was probably a counter-protest as well. So there were all these people shouting their slogans and they're all passionate about their beliefs. And this guy just wrote down on a placard, "Birds aren't real." And he started chanting this to people. And the line that he was saying is that in the 1950s, the American government started replacing real birds with fake birds that are drones that are spying on the population. So you can see it has elements of things that people do want to believe. And people kind of took this on as kind of a sign of the times, really, and embraced the absurdity of it. I like the bit about if it flies, it spies. And there's another placard I saw that said, "Bird watching goes both ways." So, you know, this kind of embodies the sort of world that we live in, that people, it kind of caricatures how people can be passionate about things that are, you know, a little bit strange sometimes. But it raises the question, which is a really important question, that we have so much information that now can bombard us. How do we know it's true? How are we going to make those decisions about what is true? In fact, and I'm going to use this very carefully, somebody did a study. They got 83 people together. And when I say somebody, it was from the Kelley School of Business Research. They got 83 people and they presented them with true stories and fake news stories. And they asked them to try and distinguish which are the real ones and which are the fake ones. And they found that 17% of participants could detect fake news better than by chance. 17%. So less than 1 in 5 people could do better than chance by flipping a coin and going, "Oh, that's fake," or "That's true." And only one person, I think, had more than 60% accuracy. So that's a worry for all of us, because there's probably more than 83 people in the room today. It means that it's very hard to distinguish what is true and what is not true. And I think it's an important topic for us to cover as to how we're going to make those distinctions. And I wanted to cover a few different ways that we can look at in order to try and help make that decision. Is it an easy process to come to that decision of what is true and what is not? No, it's not. If it was, we wouldn't have a problem. But fake news can certainly look like real news. So some of the things I wanted to look at in how we're going to make these decisions. And the first one we want to look at is sources. Where does the information come from? Does it come from just one source, or does it come from multiple sources, and are they credible sources? I wanted to, there's a quote that was buzzing around in my mind when I was thinking about this whole concept of truth and lies, and it's this quote. a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on. And who do you think said that? Anybody have any idea who said that? Scott Morrison is my opening bid from Kevin Doyle. I thought it was Winston Churchill, but what I did was I fact-checked it to see who it actually was, because you can use fact-checking websites on the internet, and people research things to get a more accurate idea of what's going on. And so I looked this up, and it wasn't Winston Churchill. In fact, the quote existed before he was born. It was a quote that was going around in the mid-1800s. Charles Haddon Spurgeon actually used it in a sermon. He didn't come up with it. He was referring to it as a common saying at the time. You can probably trace it even back further to something that Jonathan Swift said in the 1700s. So when I talk about sources, this is an illustration of two things. This is something we know about truth and lies, but it's also something that we can fact-check in order to get a more accurate picture of what is actually true. But then, some of us are probably going to be sceptical about the fact-checking websites, and so on it goes. So I think that's important to have multiple plausible sources to find out if something is true. And the next slide, which is sort of a sneak preview of, is actually what Luke did when he was compiling his gospel and the book of Acts. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know with certainty of the things you have been taught." So basically what Luke did, he went around and talked to everybody. He investigated it. He went to multiple different sources in order to compile the account that we have in our Bible of what actually happened. So it's a good approach to take. Multiple, plausible, credible sources as a way of establishing this truth. If you've got one source and it doesn't have an author, it might be sketchy. So that's one, sources. Now, the second criteria I want to use for sorting out truth and misinformation is, how does it fit into the big picture? How does it fit into general observations that we can make about the world around us? That sounds a bit vague and a bit airy-fairy, so I'm going to give you an example of one of the great conspiracy theories of all time, which is the moon landing. Now, I believe that something like 1 in 6 people think that was fake. Which means that several people in here are going to think that the moon landings were fake. And the reasons why people think that is because they'll look at little individual bits of evidence, like that photo or the video of it, and there are videos of the flag flapping in the breeze, and they think, well, how can that be? There's no wind on the moon, blah, blah, blah. So look at little individual pieces of information and go, aha! It's this grand conspiracy. And to give the conspiracy credit, it actually ticks one of the areas that a lot of conspiracies don't tick, which is that of motive, or the why of this even happening. Because when they landed on the moon, the Americans landed on the moon, they were engaged in a space race with the Russians. The Russians had already got a man into space, into orbit around the Earth, and the Americans hadn't, and so they were very sad about that. They thought they were losing the space race. And so they wanted to be the first ones to get a man on the moon. And if they didn't have the technical know-how to do that, well, they could fake it and sell that to the world as something that had happened and go, yes, we won the space race. So the motive is there, but there's a problem with that, in that NASA, the organisation that was responsible for doing that, is an organisation that employs hundreds or even thousands of people. That's kind of the big picture thinking. And this is over 50 years ago that men landed on the moon. And in that 50 years, no former NASA employee has come out and said, oh yeah, I was the camera operator on the fake moon landing thing. There's been no leakage of anybody saying, yeah, it was all fake, we were involved with it, and we didn't do it. We didn't actually land on the moon. So that's a hard thing to pull off. And I wanted to get another perspective on an actual conspiracy that did happen. Some of you will know of the Watergate scandal in the early 70s in America, where the Republican Party sent thieves into the Democrat building to get information, and they got caught. And then there was this massive cover-up that completely failed, and it ended up with a number of White House administrators going to prison and the president at the time, Nixon, having to resign in disgrace. So that was an actual conspiracy that was admitted to. And one of the guys in that, his name was Charles Colson, and he went to prison. In prison, he actually became a born-again Christian, and from that time on, he devoted his time to ministry as a writer and thinker, quite influential. But one of the things he said about that particular conspiracy was that here were the 10 most powerful men in the United States, and with all that power, we couldn't contain a lie for 2 weeks. Now that matches up with a general observation of what people are like. It's very hard to contain a lie, even for 2 weeks. So when it comes back to the moon landing, we are trying to, if we're saying that the moon landing is a fake thing, it doesn't match up to our general observation of what people are like, and that how can hundreds or thousands of people keep a lie contained for 50 years? Now, I'm not saying that proves that the moon landings actually took place. I'm just looking at what the general trend of the information suggests. You could also say, well, the Russians had a vested interest in saying, well, they didn't do it, it was all fake, and they never have. The Russians have never come out and said that. So the big picture, how things fit into the big picture, is an important part of it, is sorting out what is true and what isn't. The third thing I wanted to look at in sorting these things out is, how will I put this? Simplicity. The truth is often simple, straightforward, even elegant. Again, I'm going to go at an astronomical illustration of this. That is an illustration of how we understand the solar system to work. The sun's in the middle, and the planets orbit all around it. But we haven't always had that understanding. When I say we, I say the human race hasn't always had that understanding. Up until about the 1400s, a lot of people, scientists included, believed that the Earth was the centre of everything and all the planets and the sun revolved around the Earth. That was their understanding of it. But around that time, around the 1400s, people started realising that if you followed the movement of the planets, they would move across the sky, and some of them would go back, and then they'd go forward again. And they go, well, hang on, how does that match up with our understanding of everything revolving around the Earth? And smart people, like Copernicus and Kepler, and then ultimately Galileo, started to postulate, well, maybe the Earth isn't the centre, the sun's the centre, and everything revolves around that. And the previous understanding, if the Earth is at the centre, it meant you had to have an illustration of the solar system that looked more like this. So that's the Earth in the middle, and that's the motions of Venus and Mercury around Earth. You can see how that's complicated. It's not a straightforward, simple thing when you compare to that. So the two different propositions of whether the Earth is at the centre or the sun is at the centre, they're both legitimate propositions and they both had some data to support them. But in the end, one was a more simple, elegant explanation for what was actually going on, and one was a complicated, cumbersome, unwieldy representation of what was going on. And this leads to a thing called Occam's razor, who's there it is. William of Ockham came up with this scientific principle, which is not a proof principle, it's just a general guidance principle that, all things being equal, the simplest solution tends to be the best one. So out of those two solutions of what's revolving around what, you can see the difference. One's simple, one's elegant, one's complicated and unwieldy. So the truth is often simple. Okay, just bear that in mind as well, because what I want to do now is say that I'm talking about things that are true today, like the Earth revolving around the sun. And that is a true thing, but it's a truth that doesn't really make a lot of difference to how we live our lives. It's a true thing, but it's not massively important to what's going on. It's not massively important whether the astronauts landed on the moon or not. Maybe true, probably is true. but it doesn't make a massive difference to our lives. And there's a great verse that when I was reading through the Bible just in my own little personal time, I came to the book of 1 Timothy, and there was a sentence in there where he's actually talking about the criteria for deacons in churches that really caught my attention, because it says this, and it's only in the NIV it says this. Unfortunately, other translations use other words. But anyway, I'm sticking with the NIV. Deacons, they must keep hold of the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. And it was that whole idea of there being truths, but then there's deep truths that really grabbed my attention and made me do this whole sermon. Because there are deep truths that we need to hold and know why we hold them, because they make a difference to our lives. And I want to look at two of those truths today in my remaining time. But I want to look at them in a sort of a different way to what we normally do, because normally we'd sort of open the Bible and say, well, here's what it says, so off we go. But I want to look at it from that principle I was talking about before, about a general observation of the world and how we can explain that in two different ways, and which is the better explanation for it, and that leading to the deep truth that I'm talking about. So, all right, let's start with a general observation about the world then. When we look at the world today, do we see a place that seems great, that seems whole and healthy and going really well? What do we see when we look at the world? We see disease, a pandemic, we see poverty, we see war breaking out, we see problems between groups of people, polarisation, we see racism, we see sexism. We see all manner of problems around the world. The world looks, as a general observation, the world looks like a broken place. Would you not say that? Okay, good. All right, so that's our general observation. But one of the curious things about that observation is that when we look at the world and say it's broken, there's a part of us that's also looking at that going, it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be like that. Now, why is that? Where does that come from? Where does that idea come from? From Christian thinking, I like the explanation from, this is Romans backing me up on the state of the world. This is written 2,000 years ago. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay, as in the world is falling apart. And Paul wrote that 2,000 years ago. And brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. So that sums up the position that I'm saying about the world. But then I'm throwing in that extra thing of people, we see the brokenness, but we say it shouldn't be like that. And I like the way that C.S. Lewis encapsulates this. He says, this is a good world that has gone wrong, but still retains the memory of what it ought to have been. It's a good world that's gone wrong, but still retains the memory of what it ought to have been. The counter position to that is that we all just evolved. And this is kind of the mainstream idea in our culture these days of where we actually came from. That life came about by random chance. It's evolved to the point that we are now through a process of competition, natural selection, all that kind of process to get to where we are right now. And if that was the case, why would we have any sort of concept of a better world? If this is all we had ever known, conflict, competition, selection, why would we have this idea of there's a better way? There's a different way. There's a physicist who I've started reading a little bit about. He's a Christian, and he put it another way as well. His name's Tom McLeish, and he said he's talking about his own journey in becoming a Christian as somebody in the science fields. And he said, this is an unusual way into Christianity, but I found that an atheist secularism didn't really have a satisfying account for the outrage that we feel about things that are bad. So the point I'm making is that, yes, we can agree that the world is bad, but there's two different ways of looking at why it is bad. And the very fact that we look at it as bad but should be better is something that's intrinsic to us, and it speaks to something else that is going on around us. This also comes up when we look at the question of suffering. Even more so, personal individual suffering. That one of the strongest arguments against God that people use is that, there's so much suffering in the world, how can there be a God? How can there be a God when there's so much suffering? But when you look at that argument, you see, okay, well, I understand the point, because sometimes things are really, really painful and awful in this world. And we wonder, where is God in those circumstances? But the very fact you're asking that question in the first place is, again, speaking to this idea of, what are you actually comparing it to? If you think the world shouldn't be like this, what is the comparison you're making? Why are you comparing it to, if it's always been like this and we've never known anything else, why would we be calling this even suffering? Why would we be calling something evil and something good if we're not having some sort of comparison of something that we know nobody's experienced? So that's one of the... so we've got two possible explanations for that. We have our view as the Christians that this is a good world that's gone bad but retains a memory of how it should be. And we've got the atheist secularist view, which says, it all just kind of evolved like that. But we have somehow evolved to the point where we can see something that has never been before. How does that work? That sounds like a complicated, cumbersome, unrealistic explanation for what's going on. The simple explanation is, it's a fallen world, but we retain a memory of what it should be. So that's a deep truth. That's a deep truth of the world as we see it around us, our understanding of the world. The second one I wanted to look at today, and my final one, is I wanted to look at the spread of Christianity. So I brought there's a nice verse as well about the point I was just making. It's summed up in Ecclesiastes. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. He's set eternity in the human heart. So we can feel there should be something better than this. And it's there amongst all of us. Evolution can't explain that. That Christianity can. Let me go to my handy map. Oh, here it is. Right. So this is a map of nations of the world by Christian population. And different nations have different percentages of Christians, or people who would call themselves Christians, and we can debate back and forth, are they real Christians, blah, 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 blah. But what do you notice about the world? Christians kind of everywhere, all over the place. And this is how it looks around now. In the last, I think it's done maybe about 10 years ago, that particular illustration. So that's now, but didn't always look like that. And if we trace back in time the spread of Christianity, it comes back to one single city. I wanted to throw in a metaphor of every now and then asteroids or meteors hit the Earth, and they hit at a point, but they have this outward effect that you can see now. You can see this is a small crater in Western Australia. I think it's the Wolf Creek crater. It's only a few k's wide, but there are craters, and there's some in Australia that are like 100 kilometres wide, where a meteor has hit the Earth, and the powerful effects of that one single event has radiated outwards, and we can see the effects of what it looks like now, but we don't see what actually happened back then. But we know something happened back then because we can see what it looks like now. So the analogy I'm making is that we can make a general observation of the world and say, well, there's Christians all over the place, and they have spread from a single point outwards, like the impact of the meteor on the Earth. And that, if we can trace that back, we come to one single city. And that city is Jerusalem. That's where Christians first declared their faith in Jesus Christ. Now, why is that significant? Why am I rabbiting on about that? What point am I possibly trying to make? I think I've got a verse about that. Yeah, this is the Jewish leaders complaining about the disciples filling Jerusalem in particular. We gave you strict orders not to teach in his name. You have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. So there's an opposing view to how Christianity began, in that it began with a lie. The people lied about Jesus being resurrected from the dead, and they took that lie to the world, which is, okay, well, that's a possible explanation. It's not a great explanation, but it is a possible explanation for why we see the map of the world as it is today with Christians. But one of the really significant things about that is that if you're going to start a movement on a lie, why would you start it in Jerusalem? Why would you start it in Jerusalem of all places? Because when anyone listening to you could go for an afternoon stroll out to the empty tomb to have a look at it. If you're going to start on a lie, and these are the people who started Christianity after Jesus ascended back to heaven, they're fishermen from Galilee, so they could have gone back to Galilee. They could have started their lie there, but they didn't. They stuck around in Jerusalem where Jesus died, was put into a tomb. The tomb was sealed up. 3 days later, that tomb was empty. And these fishermen took that message to Jerusalem. And there's a quote from Frank Morrison's book, Who Moved the Stone, in which he says, nothing. Oh, here he goes. Personally, I'm convinced that no body of men or women could persistently and successfully have preached in Jerusalem a doctrine involving the vacancy of that tomb without the grave itself being physically vacant. The facts were too recent, the tomb too close to that seething centre of Oriental life. Not all the make-believe in the world could have purchased the utter silence of antiquity or given to the records their impressive unanimity. Only the truth, in all its unavoidable simplicity, could have achieved that. So the point he's making is that when I talk about the meteor, the asteroid hitting the Earth, that action, that moment was the resurrection and the empty tomb. That was the thing that powered what then happened over the next 2,000 years that led to that map you see of the world. And it doesn't work if it's built on a lie and you try and start it in Jerusalem, because anyone could just, it's like a distance from Flinders Street to the MCG. They could just walk down there, see the tomb, see that it's not empty and go, well, this doesn't make any sense, and debunk the thing straight away. The fact that it was in Jerusalem is quite a remarkable thing, unless it's the truth. Unless it's the truth. The momentum for the spread of Christianity from Jerusalem to Asia, Africa, Europe and the world, the momentum came from a massive and overwhelming event, an event like the great impact of a meteor, and that event was the resurrection from the dead of Jesus. That's the simple explanation for it. If you want to say it's a lie, that's a complicated, cumbersome explanation. It doesn't make a lot of sense. When we talk about conspiracies not holding together well, if you're trying to live your life on a lie, it doesn't hold together well. Which explanation makes more sense? Which is the simpler, more straightforward explanation? It's still incredible because it involves a man coming back from the dead, but it's still the simple explanation. That's my second deep truth. What we see in the world around us today is Christians everywhere. And that's because Jesus was crucified, but he didn't stay dead. As he predicted and foreshadowed, he rose again and changed the lives of his disciples, and they went out and they began this spread. So these are the kind of deep truths that matter. We live in a fallen world. The death and resurrection of Jesus are the path back to the world we want to live in. At the very start, I was talking about Pilate. Is he there? Yes, he is. And Pilate was asking the question, what is truth? And one of the many ironies we see in the gospel accounts of Jesus is the very person he asked that question to, that very person, the night before, probably less than 12 hours before that meeting, had said to his disciples, I am the way and the truth and the life. So it turns out Pilate asked the wrong question, because truth, deep truth, the truth, is a person who is standing right in front of him. That is the truth that really matters. Over the last few years, whenever anyone gets baptised in our church, we buy a Bible for them, and we all have the opportunity to highlight a favourite verse in that Bible. And the verse that I always highlight is John 8:32. I included 31 for the purposes of context, where Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, "If you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free." You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Before I became a Christian, I found that life was good, but it was undergirded by a deep sense of meaninglessness and futility, which definitely subtracts from any kind of joy in life. But I love that verse because it encapsulates my experience of going from not knowing Jesus, not knowing the truth, to knowing him. It was liberating, it was life-changing and powerful. Truth matters. Truth is always important. It's not good to believe and act on a lie in any shape or size. But Jesus is the truth, and that matters more than everything else.